Good morning and a very warm welcome to this EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Jacki Davis and I will have the privilege of moderating our discussion as always this week. And as always, with me throughout the hour are Janis Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies at the EPC, and Chief Executive Fabian Zuleeg. And we have two special guests appearing this week. First, joining us a little bit later on to discuss the EU's response to the hijacking of a plane by Belarus and the seizure of the opposition activist and his girlfriend, we will have senior policy analyst Amanda Paul. And later on, to discuss the outcome of the climate discussions at this week's Summit of EU Leaders, we'll be joined by Annika Hedberg, head of the EPC's Sustainable Prosperity for Europe programme. As always, totally interactive discussion, questions from me to our panel, and later on, I hope, from all of you. You're all muted for now, but if you want to write your question, click on the Q&A button, not the chat button, the Q&A button, and write your question, and please be as brief as you can. If you want to speak your question, as it were, I'm not sure that's correct English, but never mind, please click the raise hands button and I will allow you to talk when the time comes. And if you're having IT issues and need some help, the chat box is there and our magical team behind the scenes will do their best to help you. But we want to start with the discussions at the summit this week and prior to the summit on COVID-19. And Janis, if I could start with you, and probably the most significant development since we last met, and indeed for quite some time, this agreement on an EU digital COVID certificate. It's a draft agreement, but it does pave the way, we are told, for this certificate to be able to be used. You can correct me on the exact timing. I think by the end of June was the statement, or maybe a bit earlier. Can you just outline for me what was agreed, and I hate to put this simplistically, but who won? Was it the Parliament, who basically had talked about this as the restoration of free movement? With the certificate, we could begin to go where we want, when we want, or for the Council, which wanted something that was more an enabling document, but they could still impose their own restrictions on top of that? How did it play out in the end?
Well, first of all, they decided and they now need to formally adopt, but I think that is morally a formality, the EU Digital COVID Certificate. So this is how it is now called. If you remember how it started off, there were at least one or two other names which have been floating over the past weeks, past months. So that certificate will allow people who have been vaccinated, who have a PCR test, who have gone through COVID-19, which they can prove by having a positive PCR test from the past, to have the certificate, and that will allow people to travel more freely throughout Europe, both with respect to personal, but also to professional travel. So I think that in general, I think this is a very good result that we're getting to this point, because it will make all our lives practically more easy. However, it still needs to be implemented. So there's some technical questions which still need to be settled, and we'll have to see how things work. Now, with respect to who won, comparing the Parliament and the Council, I think that, yes, the European Parliament wanted more. It wanted that there would be no additional restrictions besides the certificate, for example, so no quarantines, but the member states, and that the member states should refrain from any additional restrictions. However, the member states have found a way to make sure that they can still impose additional restrictions if necessary. So if there is a need because of public health considerations, they can put additional restrictions on
and presumably it is up to them to decide whether those circumstances exist. Is there any mechanism for the Commission to say, as they're supposed to with any suspension of Schengen normally, yes, we agree, you're justified, or not? No. They can just decide unilaterally.
The certificate doesn't change the competence structure. So what we have seen over the entire period of the COVID-19 crisis, it is the member states who are allowed to decide on themselves on what the restrictions will be in detail. However, there is now a commitment to refrain from additional restrictions, but member states themselves can decide to impose some in case they have a case to make, but the Commission won't be able to stop them. The second question, which had been between the Parliament and the Council, and again, the Parliament could not get its way through, was that the testing So people who are PCR testing, for example, that testing would be free of charge. That is something which the Parliament had asked for, had fought for, but member states have not agreed to that. However, in order to come to a compromise, the Commission has committed to use 100 million from the emergency support instrument to support member states in their effort to make the PCR testing free, or at least cheaper than it is now in certain member states. As we all know, there are very different regimes throughout the different member states. So the Commission will help.
Okay, so this, of course, the Parliament was calling for this, saying otherwise it's discriminatory because of the cost of testing and so on, and doesn't give all citizens the same right. Again, a compromise, some money, but not free testing. Fabian, in terms of the global vaccination campaign, the World Health Organization chief last week claimed that vaccinating children in rich countries around the world before you vaccinate the vulnerable in poorer countries would, as he described it, be a moral catastrophe. We saw, I think, Ursula von der Leyen, among others, rejecting that argument. How do you think, what's the EU's response to those issues? It's obviously also an issue for the United States, it's an issue for the UK at the moment. What was the EU's response, and will its promise of more doses being donated, is that enough to assuage the criticism, do you think?
I think it's a very difficult situation. Yes, of course, much more could be done globally. And there is an argument which talks about what is morally right, whether we are prioritizing our own citizens, even those ones which might not be as vulnerable, such as young people or children, or whether we share more doses. But there's also a political reality that people are expecting that within Europe we are moving towards something which resembles normality. And there have been many concerns about young people going back into education settings, going back to a normal attendance-based model. And in many countries, there's an expectation that vaccinations will be available. So I think we will have to find a way of trying to do both, squaring the circle. So putting much more effort into what we do globally, enabling also the expansion of production capacity across the globe so that we have more doses available. But I don't think we will be in a situation where we will exclude young people in Europe because there's too much demand in certain populations for them.
But strong words, Janis, from the WHO. What sort of impact do you think, if any, did they have on the discussion between EU leaders at this week's summit?
Well, we have already seen in the past that there has been pressure on the EU, on EU leaders. If we remember the discussion we've had triggered by the Biden administration with respect to the waiver, there have already been pressures on the EU, and the argument being put forward that not enough is being done to support low or lower income countries is correct, because 0.3% of vaccines are now reaching low income countries. So that percentage is far too low. However, on the other hand, if you compare the EU to others, the EU has been doing more. It is exporting. It is the biggest exporter of vaccines to non-EU countries, including also low-income countries. But much more needs to be done, and it needs to be done not out of reasons of solidarity, but out of reasons of enlightened self-interest. Because as long as the virus is spreading, the danger of mutations, of new variations of the variations coming back to hit us also is still out there. So this is not only in the interest of these countries, but it's in the interest of the EU and other strongly developed countries to support all those around the globe who are far away from vaccination.
And indeed, we're seeing this with the so-called Indian variant, which is now leading to question marks, despite its hugely successful vaccination campaign, question marks now over the UK and its plans for opening up. So an illustration of how important this is. Let me move on to two other topics before we bring in Amanda and talk about Belarus. Fabian, Brexit. there was a conversation between EU leaders about EU-UK relations in the wake of the recent tensions. We've seen tensions, of course, on the Northern Ireland Protocol, but also on fisheries and other areas. When you read the conclusions from the summit, they don't seem to really take us much further forward, but there are two things that struck me. One, the warning again against anything that undermines a single market, but also calling on the UK, and I quote, to respect the principle of non-discrimination among member states. Is this a broadside at the UK? Because there have been reports of the UK trying to pick off individual member states, again, a tactic it tried in the negotiations on the withdrawal agreement and it failed. Is this a sign of the UK, the EU saying, don't try it because it won't work?
Yeah, I think what we are seeing is that leaders wanted to send a signal, that they wanted to make sure that there's an understanding on the UK side that the overall stance of the European Union is supported by the leaders, that there is not going to be a compromise on the key principles which have been pushed from the beginning. So while there is a wish to manage the relationship, to make sure that the tension gets taken out, in particular of the Northern Ireland situation, there was also a clear signal that this doesn't mean that the principles will be abandoned or that there will not be pressure on the UK to adhere to the TCA, which they have signed up to.
But in the meantime, any sign of any progress on the Northern Ireland Protocol issue? Because there had been warnings of more UK unilateral action if nothing is done by what is known in Northern Ireland as the marching season, which we are approaching, a very sensitive time for relations between the two communities in Ireland, in Northern Ireland.
There are certainly ongoing talks and some solutions have been suggested, but for the moment, we are still in a bit of a deadlock, not least because domestic politics in the UK and in particular in Northern Ireland is very difficult. There have been some key changes as well. The unionists in Northern Ireland are now taking a rather more hardline position in relation to the protocol. So it's a very, very tricky situation. And even if we resolve this immediate issue, I think the problem here is that the long-term situation is going to remain tricky because we are in a situation where whatever direction we're going into, there are parts of the Northern Ireland community which are not happy with that direction. So I think we are going to have to get used to the idea that we need to manage that situation on an ongoing basis and not just getting it done. But when you look at the leader statement, I think the one thing I would read in it more than anything else is that leaders don't want to deal with this anymore. They want to move on, but it keeps coming back.
Indeed. One question from the audience before we turn to Belarus. There's another question on climate change. I'll come back to that later. But on the new Pact for Migration and Asylum, we have seen in recent weeks, as happens now every time at this time of year, an increase in the number of boats arriving on our shores of refugees, of migrants coming to Europe. In the meantime, there are these ongoing negotiations on the Pact. Janis, we'll come back to this, I hope, in a future update in more detail, but briefly now, are we getting anywhere on a pact which would provide a lasting solution in terms of how the EU responds to this issue?
No, we are continuing to struggle. We know what the main problems are, especially with respect to the solidarity dimension of the new pact. Now, at the summit this week, there was a discussion, a brief discussion at least, about the issue of migration. The Spanish Prime Minister informing his colleagues about the situation in Ceuta. And after the meeting, it was also Charles Michel who said that they support the Spanish government and they will come back to the issue at the June European Council. So there was no progress now, and we have to wait and whether there will be progress maybe at the June summit when they will again come back to the issue in more fundamental terms, as they have indicated earlier this week.
Thank you very much. And hopefully we, as I say, will come back to this issue as well and analyse where they're going, what the sticking points are at another event update soon. So let me now bring in EPC Senior Policy Analyst Amanda Paul. Amanda, thank you very much for joining us today. The most dominant issue at this summit, of course, those developments over and in Belarus, with the hijacking of the plane, with the seizure of the activist and his girlfriend. I mean, astonishing developments. And the EU's response was greeted and characterized as unexpectedly decisive, unexpectedly quick, and unexpectedly united. Would you share that analysis of where we are now? We'll come to what might happen further down the road in a moment, but in terms of that initial EU response, was it good enough?
Yes, thanks, Jackie. I think the EU's response was good enough. That's probably quite a unique thing to say. But I think the seriousness of the situation, I mean, the state-sponsored hijacking meant that they need to have a swift response. I mean, all EU leaders across the board were absolutely outraged. And let's remember, this was an attack on a European airliner that was traveling between 2 EU member states and carrying somebody who should have been safe in EU territory. He wasn't. So this has been seen as an assault on Europe itself. And I think it also underlines the fact that Belarus is becoming an increasingly rogue state.
And in terms of where we go from here, so there were a number of measures EU leaders agreed on. They agreed to increase sanctions. They agreed to ban flights by Belarusian airlines and so on. But in terms of the big work that now has to be done is on those sanctions. Who will be on the list? What will be on the list? As we said, remarkable unity among the EU leaders. Would you expect that to hold? I mean, what sort of sanctions are they looking at? And is there a risk that as we get into the detail of what needs to be done beyond declaratory statements, that unity begins to unravel?
I mean, I actually think that the unity will hold. And again, this reflects the very, very serious nature of the situation. We need to see sanctions this time that are really tough. I mean, the sanctions already on the Lukashenko regime, but I would say some of them are rather soft. This time, they need to be tough. They need to focus on Lukashenko and his cronies. They need to be cut off from their financial lifelines, if I can put that. They need to focus on doing bans on business with Belarus's big companies, state-owned operations that are crucial for Lukashenko and his cronies. Anything that is keeping basically this regime afloat. It's really important that these sanctions are strong and meaningful.
And do you think it will provoke any reaction in Belarus? Can it really make a difference? Or as you say, is Belarus now on a path to rogue statehood that is sort of irreversible, and they will simply take this as more fuel to continue down the path they're on? How do you see the response from Belarus? Or, I mean, in a sense, does it matter? The important thing is you have seen an outrage, you have seen unacceptable behavior by a country, and the EU must be seen to respond. I'm just wondering if you see any sign that Belarus might, because of this action, change its ways in any way.
I mean, I don't think that President Lukashenko is suddenly going to, leave. That's not going to happen. One could hope that those that support him, or some of those in the military and security apparatus, that might start to crumble. But I mean, I think what we are going to see is a further enhancement of the relationship between President Putin and Lukashenko. We've seen that there's a meeting today between the two of them in Moscow. I mean, this is actually very bad news for Belarus. The last thing Belarus needs is a closer relationship with Russia. In the last couple of months, there's been an increasing growing influence of Russia economically, security terms, and politically in the country. And let's also be honest, I mean, Lukashenko might be Putin's man for now, but that doesn't mean that he wouldn't find another man in the future. So I don't think Lukashenko will leave, but that doesn't mean that the EU shouldn't keep pushing and pushing. But at the same time, they need to continue to give support to civil society. They need to continue to support independent media. This is very important given the amount of disinformation that is flowing around in in Belarus. And there are also other things that could also be done beyond the sanctions that we're talking about today. For example, they can target more dirty money that is flowing around in Europe. They could impose sanctions on Belarus sovereign debt. This is an area that's been used in the past with some other countries. This is important. They could, they could focus on other small things like cigarette smuggling, which, believe it or not, gives some sort of quite a lot of income actually to the state. So we need to keep pushing and pushing, because this regime, what it does, cannot be tolerated. I know we're focusing on Roman Protasevich and his situation, which is disastrous, but let's also remember there's hundreds and hundreds of other political prisoners being held in prisons in Belarus in absolutely atrocious conditions, being tortured on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. One question before I come to Janis and Fabian on this, from Ignacio Aronis Velasco, and it links to your comment about President Putin and President Lukashenko coming closer together. If financial lifelines of the regime are cut, is there a risk that the Lukashenko regime becomes ever more dependent on Russian aid, and that this could all, as a result, backfire on the EU? A comment to that, Amanda, and then I'll come to Fabian and Janis.
I mean, look, Jacki, I think in the beginning, the EU were quite sort of cautious on the sort of sanctions they placed, simply for this reason, because they were worried about Belarus becoming increasingly dependent on Russia. But I think we've gone way beyond that point now. There's no return. I mean, President Lukashenko in the past has always sort of followed this balancing approach, being careful not to have too much Russia, balancing with the EU, but this option has now gone. So we are going to see a serious developing closer relationship between the Russians and Belarus. As I said, this is very dangerous. I mean, Russia has always wanted to unite the two countries. So I think economic integration will definitely be on the card. And this is very bad news for Belarusian society, which is why it's important that the EU acts quickly and it keeps acting. I mean, that Belarus doesn't just disappear down the EU agenda in 2 or 3 weeks' time, which is sometimes the case. We need to keep it there in the highlight, in the radar.
Thank you very much. And Janis, there was also, talking about President Putin, there were also strong words from the summit for Russia's behavior, with criticism and condemning Russia for, and I quote, illegal, provocative and disruptive activities against the EU member states and beyond. And in particular, expressing solidarity with the Czech Republic after a week in which we heard that Russian agents had been involved in an explosion at a munitions factory back in 2014. And Russia published a list of what he called unfriendly countries, only 2 names on it, the United States and the Czech Republic. How do you read the EU statement on Russia, linking it to the discussion on Belarus? And again, Russia's an area where the EU has struggled to maintain unity in the past. Are we seeing signs, as with Belarus, of a coming together and a stronger will to act together, or was this exceptional?
Well, we don't know yet. Because, well, first of all, the discussion they've had this week at the summit was a discussion which they had programmed for a while. So it was nothing which came on the agenda out of the blue. But the discussions have been going on among EU leaders. There are different opinions on how to deal with Russia. There will also be another discussion on the issue again in June, when the High Representative, will present some policy options of how to deal with Russia in the future. We know that there are different approaches. The French President Macron arguing that we need to find a new way of discussing and having a dialogue with Moscow, that sanctions are not the right things to do and don't work at the end of the day. So we're seeing that there are different approaches, and we know that in Berlin, obviously, there is a different approach vis-a-vis Moscow, and we are all now watching what will happen in September when the new government comes into place and how the Russia policy will then develop also in Germany. So you have these differences. You will, I think, continue to have discussions about how the strategic cooperation or the strategic relationship with Russia shall develop. And now the situation with respect to Belarus is also putting some question marks as to whether the Russians were informed, as to whether the Russians will be extremely supportive of Lukashenko now. We're seeing that this is the first incidences of planes and trying to fly to Moscow, not being able to because the Russian authorities not allowing them to find another route around Belarus. So there could also be developments because of the Belarus situation, which will have an effect on EU-Russia, but we're far away from having a joint position of how to deal with Moscow in future.
And one last foreign policy question, and it relates to this question of EU unity, Fabian, not at the summit, but prior to the summit. In response to the situation in Gaza, there was a call for a ceasefire, but this time 26 countries supported that call. One, Hungary, did not and accused the EU of anti-Israel bias. I wonder, first in terms of foreign policy, and does this throw into question yet again the whole unanimity rule? Some people suggested Josep Borrell went ahead in publishing what had been agreed by the 26 as a way of showing that the unanimity rule can't work. But more broadly, in terms of Hungary's relationship with the EU, yet another case of throwing a spanner into the works in quite a dramatic fashion. What can we read into that about the developing situation between Hungary and its EU partners?
Well, I think what is clear is that when it comes to foreign policy, that unity is not there yet, that we also don't have the mechanisms to enforce unity. We might condemn what Hungary did, so we might say that it's the wrong choice, but in the end, it is Hungary's choice. Because in foreign policy, there is no way any position can be implemented in a country which chooses to go a different route. Now, why did Hungary do this? I think what we continue to see is that Orban chooses to needle the other leaders to make things more difficult, to signal that he's there and that he can do this. In the end, when it comes to some of the other substantive areas, we have seen that Hungary did not deviate when just as we were talking about Belarus, they were in line. So there's also a judgment being made about on what issues do you create problems and on what issues do you not. But I think what we also have to face is, regardless of Hungary itself, is do we have the right mechanisms in foreign policy to deal with the kind of challenges which we are facing now? We continue to come back to this also in these updates, that we have global challenges which require the European Union to act together, yet we still don't have the mechanisms to actually ensure that we act together. And very many times we see a deviation in policies because of diverging interests. So I think that tension is something, as long as we have the current setup, we are also going to continue to have that tension, whether it's with Hungary or whether it's on particular topics. There are some big topics which we still haven't really got a European position. So how does Europe stand vis-a-vis China? What are we going to do in the next years vis-a-vis Russia? What are we going to do in terms of transatlantic cooperation? I mean, all of these questions we still really don't have an answer.
No, thank you very much. Janis, I know you wanted to come in. Brief one if you would, because we need to move to climate after that.
Just one addition to what Fabian said, because obviously we have a more fundamental problem which we are not able to overcome, which is the unanimity rule. However, if we look especially into sanctions and sanctions issues, we've seen that many countries, not only the Hungarian government, has decided to use its veto power. Remember Cyprus vetoing certain sanctions, or others in the past who have either vetoed or threatened to veto and thus have made a compromise at a lower common denominator only possible at the European level. However, what the difference here is that many of these governments have been acting on the basis of what they perceive to be their core national interests and have then said, we cannot agree to a decision A, B, or C. But in the Hungarian case, in the Hungarian government's case, we've seen that they've been ready to serve the interests of other countries. So it's not their own national interests, it's serving the national interests of other players, non-European players, and that they have done repeatedly. And that makes it qualitatively different. And especially when it comes to autocratic regimes, where Hungary also wants to give a signal that from the outside, we should not intervene when decisions are being taken in other member states, which obviously also motivated not because of also your foreign policy reasons, but also because of the criticism vis-a-vis how the Hungarian government is treating internal politics.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Amanda. I know she's still with us, but turned her camera off. But thank you so much, Amanda, for joining us and sharing with us your immense expertise on Belarus. We do appreciate it very much. Let us bring in our other guest today. Delighted to welcome Annika Hedberg. Hello, Annika. Welcome back. To EPC Update. Annika, as I said earlier, head of the EPC's Sustainable Prosperity for Europe programme. And Annika, climate on the agenda at the EU summit. I must confess, when I read the conclusions, I thought, well, what was all that about, really? I don't think I've ever seen such short and anodyne conclusions, but what did they focus on at this discussion? Why this discussion right now? And what did they focus on? And am I right in my reading of the summit conclusions, or is there more there than meets the eye, as it were?
Yes, I could start by saying that the member states, obviously, they have agreed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 from the 1990 levels. So the big news really at this leaders meeting was that the discussion on how this would be done, and specifically how the national targets should be set, was in the end postponed for later. And this decision was made because the majority of member states didn't want to engage in a battle with Poland and countries like Bulgaria over money and emission cutting rules at this stage. But it's also worth to keep in mind that the Commission is publishing 12 climate policy proposals in mid-July. And this will surely lead to further debate with the Parliament as well as with member states. This is such a major exercise that we can just assume that there's lots more to be discussed. And
Annika, they're going to have the battle over how you allocate the cuts. They're going to have the arguments over money. Indeed, as you say, Poland talking about this it's a question of fairness, and we really this is why this issue matters. But does simply kicking the can down the road help in any way? And did we need clarity on this at all before the Commission comes up with its so-called Fit for 55 legislative package, or is it okay for now to kick the can down the road?
I think it's okay. It's just saying that the climate package, that's the Fit for 55 package that the Commission is going to put forward. This is a major exercise. The Commission has gone back to policies that were made to achieve 40% reduction in emissions, and it's now publishing an updated policy framework that is in line with this 55% reduction goal. And so I think it actually works that now at this stage, we brought the climate on the leaders' agenda before the Commission's package is published. On one hand, to prepare member states for the package, but also to take the temperature a bit. And at least the Council President, Charles Michel, was able to say that we have affirmed our common goals. So in many ways, this provided the backing for the Commission to continue working on its package, and we will continue the battle once the package is actually out.
We'll come back to some of those details in a minute, but Fabian, I'm wondering whether it was wise of Charles Michel to take the temperature, as Annika puts it at this point, if all he could say afterwards, well, we've affirmed our commitment to do it, but actually all it did was expose just how difficult it is going to be to get agreement on the allocations of reductions on the money and so on. Was it a wise tactic to bring it forward now and end off with really very little to show for it? Does it matter?
I think to some extent it won't matter. I think it is, of course, preferable to have progress and to be able to show that things are really moving forward. But we should also bear in mind that there is a timing issue here. And there's a timing issue because we have the transatlantic question. What are we going to do with the United States? And if the United States continue to go down a route where they're signaling very strongly that they want to cooperate with the European Union on climate change, we will have to find a response rather sooner than later to react to that. And I think there's also the question of COP26 moving forward on that level. It's not that far away anymore, and we need to have a European position, which is also checked with our allies in the global climate change field, so that we can make real progress in.
Yeah. Can I just follow up on that, Janis? I'll come to you in a moment, but as you mentioned the US in particular, Fabian, question from Olaf Ovrebo, sorry if I mispronounce your surname. Can we expect any announcements of substantial climate cooperation between the EU and US soon? The summit on June 15th would be, he says, an obvious occasion. And if we can expect something substantial, on what topics? Fabian.
I think we don't know at this moment in time, but in general terms, it is going well. There is a real exchange across the Atlantic about the climate change topic. There are some signals that on some of the topics which have been very difficult in the past, there might be compromises. But I think in the end, we still need to get more concrete. We need to actually see what does this mean on the particular dossiers. Are there ways we can actually agree? But overall, the signals certainly are positive.
Thank you. Janis, on this broad point, your assessment of the summit discussions and where we are, and then Annika, I'd like to come back on COP26 and where we're going, and then after that, maybe look at the role of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. But Janis, your overall assessment of where we are.
Yes, with respect to the bigger picture, I think taking out what you were saying earlier, was that not little to show for? And was that the right tactic? Well, we've seen that we've had similar experiences in the past where when the issue was discussed, many of us were arguing that this is not enough. They are postponing decisions. They should be more firm in what we're asking for. It's not the first time, for example, that we see that the Polish Prime Minister, let's not forget, he's also very much under pressure at home, is spearheading those who are arguing we need to make sure that we don't pay a too high price for what we are asking to do in terms of the fight against climate change. But I think we have been seeing this, and we continue to see that. And we will see that EU leaders at the top level will not be able to agree, that there will be major differences among them. And I think that is something which politically is necessary, because that will increase the pressure on all those outside the European Council, those who at the end of the day are also ready to go on the street to fight for the cause of doing something more profound when it comes to climate change, to do so. Because what we're talking about is a major, major challenge which we all are facing, having to change totally how we run our economies. And that is something where, yes, this will require a lot of stamina, and it will also lead to a lot of political differences in future. So I think the question of little to show for is something we will have to live with in order to make progress. The question mark is whether we will make progress fast enough and how much the pressure will be on the EU 27 to deliver. And by the way, it's not only a battle between the 27, it's also a battle within individual member states where you have different positions fighting against each other.
On that question of making progress faster and whether we're capable of doing it, the EU leaders did call, particularly on G20 countries, to step up their ambitions ahead of the COP26 meeting in Glasgow. Annika, your reading, particularly in light of these developments in the US with the new administration, your reading now of COP26, what we can expect, how optimistic we should be about the result?
I think, first of all, I would like to say, because often we're saying that EU is operating and just looking inside, and we're not taking enough into context enough into account. And I think that it's important to recognize that the EU is really understanding how important the global context is, and all of these recognitions that we need to push for climate diplomacy. We need to work with international partners. Now, obviously, enormous prospects and possibilities to work together with US in actually aligning our agendas. It is recognized, and I think what is sometimes tricky for the EU is how does it do it, and how can it actually continue to push its climate diplomacy? We know that there is an enormous momentum now with COP26 on its way. We want that countries will submit revised pledges that are ambitious, and the EU is looking especially at China and India, that we really want China and India to commit to strong emission cuts at COP26, but also going ahead towards the COP26, US has and will be an important partner with us. It is extremely important that we are able to work together and get other international partners to join and increase the ambition. And obviously the Biden administration has entered with clear ambition, with a lot of energy. And this is actually can be also tricky for the EU to manage, because for years now, the EU has been progressing, while again, the US under the Trump administration was losing behind.
But is this what we were waiting for, the US to
We
step up
were, but the EU is not always a very good global player in this regard. And I would argue that maybe what can easily happen is that the US comes into the game very powerfully, but the EU may not be able to balance it out, and actually what may happen is that the US will start to dominate and the direction where we need to go. And I think EU should really try to be true to itself and recognize that it has already achieved a lot.
Thank you. Before we come on, I want to come on to the potential role of the EU recovery plans and others, but there was one other issue, Annika, if I could just pick up with you. I think the other area of discussion and argument in the run-up to the summit and was the question of the ETS, the emissions trading scheme, and the extension of it to areas like transport and so on. Did that argument play out at the summit? Is it something for another day, another can kick down the road? Can you just explain a little bit what's the issue here?
And maybe I can go back to this big issue around the allocation of emission cuts, because that was really the issue what we decided that we better postpone it for later. So the dividing issue were these national goals, and countries like Poland and Bulgaria, they're trying to get as much financial support for the energy transitions as possible. And they would like wealthier countries to be responsible for a bigger share of the 2030 emission cuts. And one way how we could see this playing out in the future is that indeed, as I think it was Poland that has requested it, is that we could use, for example, EU's modernization fund to support these countries in transition. But as I mentioned, this was a dividing issue at this leaders meeting. But when we have the Fit for 55 package out, we can expect many more dividing issues.
What an optimistic picture you
Sorry,
Annika, let me ask you a general question.
Realistic.
Sorry, Fabian, you wanted to come in.
No, just to say, I mean, I think that's of course right, and there will be that conflict also between member states. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't lose sight of the need to have a fair transition and the need to make sure that the burden of the challenging changes which have to happen in all societies are not borne disproportionately by those who cannot actually bear them. And that doesn't just apply between countries, it also applies within countries. And I think it is something we really need to pay attention to, because if we are not ensuring that this fairness is there, I think the targets which we are setting now will turn out to be unrealistic, because if populations don't support it, it's not going to happen.
And Annika, just link to that, and then I'll come back to you, Janis, in a moment, but this need to have a fair transition. Let me link this to the discussion on the EU's recovery plan, to the national plans that we're seeing, and of course, green and action on climate seen as absolutely central alongside digital. That, the Commission has argued repeatedly, is the way to recovery. It's the way to a sustainable recovery. How do you see the potential role? We'll come to whether it's likely to actually happen, but the the potential role of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, both in terms of pursuing that green agenda, but also taking into account these fair, just transition considerations?
Thanks. I'll start with just picking up on what Fabian was said about the importance of just transition, because it's recognized. We won't achieve the 2030 to 2050 goals if people, be it citizens or workers, or if our regions do not see the value in this transition, if they don't participate in this transition. And this is not just about the funds that are made available, be it under recovery or other means, but it is really about ensuring that we recognize the concerns and needs of people, as well as different regions, that we engage with them, incentivize them to play a role. And it is just this recognition as well that we need to push for, that we recognize that there is an enormous social dimension that we will need to address if we want to make this transition a success. So when it comes then to the recovery and resilience, maybe just to say that so far, what we see is that very different kind of proposals have been tabled. There is a risk that we may miss the opportunity to use these recovery funds to promote, for example, the twin green and digital transition, or if we just want to talk about the green transition, we see that member states have, or a number of member states have not actually put as big of a share into the green transition as what we could have hoped for. So this is really a risk. And we also see that a number of member states are suggesting to promote development of, for example, fossil fuel infrastructure that clearly goes or is in contradiction with the green transition objectives. So there is still work to be done, and what we should be seeing, and there's enormous potential. There is this money available to actually modernize our economies, and we could be using this money to support renovation projects with focus on energy efficiency and renewables, or projects on electrifying mobility, support sustainable mobility as well as agriculture to enhance circular economy, and we should be seeing more of this.
Yeah. Janis, a suggestion there from Annika. What we're seeing so far, we've discussed this previously on Update. Will the green and the digital really feature when it comes down to the national level? The Commission, of course, has to assess all these national plans, many of them now in. I think we're almost at the point of that assessment, and number one, how does that process roll out now of beginning to disperse the funds? And from the signs you see, do you share Annika's concern that ambition of really using this to pursue the green agenda, the climate agenda, may not be realized in practice?
Well, let me start with a side remark, which is the good news of the day, that the own resources decision has been ratified in all member states. If we remember some months ago, we were not sure that we might not face a major hiccup in one or the other countries. Let us all remember that we also fear that the German Constitutional Court might have done a mistake, which it hasn't. So that's the good news of the day, because that means that we can actually progress with respect to the facility. Now, not all member states have submitted their plans yet. A big majority has. And if you look into them individually, you will see that there is a green and a digital dimension. Now, you can argue as to whether it is enough, whether it's going always in the most ambitious direction it should be going, whether the funds shall be used in the best way. All these questions are valid, but at least it's going in that direction, and the Commission will now scrutinize all these plans, and they will do it consecutively. So that we won't lose too much time. And I'm sure that given where the discussion is, that also us who have been discussing this issue for so many times, and there is public attention to it. So the Commission is under pressure to make sure that when looking at the national plans, that they actually reflect the need for green and digital, that it is reflected substantially enough. And let's not forget, once the Commission has given its feedback, it also needs to go through the Council. So there's another level where I'm sure that member states will go and look into individual plans, and then also be ready to raise their hand and say, this is not enough. There's more which needs to be done with respect to this and that issue. Yes, there will be some horse trading between member states, but we're talking about a process which now is much more public than it has been in the future. But however, even if we get to the plan that the plans will be revised, will be improved, hopefully, the question is still how they will be implemented. And this is where the big question then comes up, where you then have to monitor as to whether what had been originally been put into the plans will be implemented in the way in which it was announced that it would be implemented. That's the big question then.
Thank you. Fabian, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I think clearly implementation is crucial, but there are also opportunities there. I think there are synergies also between the digital area and the green area, which can be used more. And I think it is also for the Commission to continue to push the member states to develop these so that it's not a tick box exercise where you've handed in your plan and that's the end of a process. But the other thing I wanted to highlight is also we shouldn't focus only on money. Of course, it is important to have the funds available, but it is also about having the right framework, having the right standards, the regulations, making sure that we continue to develop the instruments that we also are looking at. What are we doing in areas such as trade and investment policy? Do we move towards a carbon border adjustment mechanism? I mean, there are many areas where this drive towards a more sustainable, a more green Europe will have to have an impact also on the legislation, the standards which we have.
And Annika, you wanted to come, please. Annika, do react.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on the green and digital transition. And so just to say, first of all, it's great that it's there in writing, and that we see that a number of member states are picking on it and are proposing projects along these lines. What I've heard is one of the criticisms is that member states are not always very good in aligning these agendas. And for example, putting forward proposals where digitalization would be used as an enabler to, for example, green our energy systems, to green our mobility, to green our food systems. And so there is much more scope to be done in that space. And perhaps recognizing that the member states have not been very good at doing this, it could be also a role for the Commission to actually support and guide member states in this regard.
Yet another area where joined up thinking, we talk about it a lot, but it doesn't always happen in practice. But Annika, can I just ask you to outline sort of the next steps? So we get the Fit for 55 package mid-July, I believe, just about spoiling everybody's last month before a much needed post-COVID summer break because of the huge enormity of this package. And that will consist of, it's a very large number of legislative proposals, isn't it? When then do we expect EU leaders to come back to the issue? What will happen? And if I could ask you on a more personal level, what do you think we should be looking out for in that package? What for you are going to be the key determinants of whether this really will, the aim here, of course, is to make sure that we update EU legislation to meet that increased ambition. What should we be looking for as a sign that, yes, this package really could deliver? It's a slightly unfair question, but I don't know whether you can help us with that. But time frame first, where do we go from here? How does it work out?
So obviously, yes, there is a big push to try to get this package out before the summer, just before everyone goes on holiday. So there will be plenty of time during the summer break for people to get acquainted with what is there. I understood that Council President Michel already suggested that we will return to the issue in the autumn. Yeah. So I assume that the package will be discussed, at least some parts of it will be discussed already in the autumn. But clearly this is a big package and this will take a while to actually then progress with it. And when looking at it, I think that what makes it so important is that it is so comprehensive. We'll be looking at tougher carbon dioxide standards for cars, more ambitious renewable energy targets, which is going to raise the whole issue around role for biomass in this, which is going to be a very divisive issue as well. There will be relook at the carbon markets and this proposal that has been dividing people as well, countries as well, and stakeholders, whether there should be an introduction for or including road transport and heating from buildings also under the ETS. And all of these are going to be very divisive issues, but then at the same time, this is, in the end, one has to look at the package as a whole and see how ambitious is it. And I would say many people are looking at the renewables as they are seeing that it was a lot of work that was done already on this file before, and reopening it is going to be a very tricky exercise. So many are looking at how ambitious will the new version be and what will it change compared to the last one.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to, before we close in a moment, ask you for your personal hope, wish, dream, priority. But Fabian, for you, what should we look out for particularly in this Fit for 55 package? And do you believe, Annika's described the very complex negotiations that will follow, that we can get to something meaningful that will deliver on those new ambitious targets?
I would come back to what I was saying before in terms of implementation. I think we're very good at the European level to come up with great targets, with good looking packages, with also the momentum, which is important. But in the end, the question is, how does that look like on the ground? I think in the past, unfortunately, we've had many times when we have been ambitious, when we have put things up there, but then when it comes to the translation of that into reality, we have lagged. And very often it is then pushed ahead, maybe another year, another 2 years before action happens. 2050 sounds very far away, so maybe we don't need to do things now. And all of the evidence now shows us that it is action now which is needed. We need to change the path, otherwise we have no chance in getting to these ambitious goals in the end. So what we need to see is an ambitious package, but also one which starts to be implemented immediately and is not continuously postponed into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. You talk about targets. I remember not being at all an expert in this area when the first EU climate targets came out, and the numbers all magically were 20. So it was 20 for emission cuts, it was 20 for renewables, and it was 20 for energy efficiency. And in my non-expert way, I said, it can't be that an ambitious but realistic target is exactly the same number in all three areas. So ever since then, I've been a tad cynical about the targets, but maybe that's just a personal thing. But Janis, for you, the key things you will be looking for when this package is published?
I think the key thing for me which I will be looking for is how big of a struggle we will have among the EU 27. And yes, Annika is right. We will have to look into the entire package and then judge as to whether the package is sufficient enough or not. But I'm sure that what we will witness from the autumn and thereafter, maybe even until the end of this 5-year period, is in a major struggle between the EU 27. And also a major struggle within the EU 27. As I was saying earlier, we're going to have an enormously difficult political discussion ahead of us. And I think what we've seen over the past years is that you can only have progress if there is sufficient pressure on EU governments. And I think this will be key. Will there be sufficient political pressure from the streets at the European level, at the national level, putting pressure on member states actually to deliver? And just one small side note, the fact that you will probably have the involvement of the Green Party in the next German federal government is going to be an enormous political asset.
Thank you very much. And before we close, Annika, I'd like to give you the last word in terms of, you've been working on these issues for a very long time. We are now at a sort of crossroads moment in terms of the EU delivering, not just setting targets, but as we've said, delivering on them. What is your personal priority, hope for where we will be at the end of this process? Are you now optimistic that the EU is on the right track, or is that would that be too strong a word?
Maybe too strong. I would say that obviously it's major that we have the Green Deal. They're providing the guidance, the direction. It's recognized as being our growth strategy. So we are, in many ways, we are under the same umbrella, knowing where we want to go. But I think, and as Fabian already mentioned a number of times, the implementation will be a key. Yeah. The buy-in will be a key, where the just transition considerations will be essential. And overall, I think that there needs to be this recognition that this is going to be a very transformative process. And what we are talking about is a system change. And this is, for a very long time, we've been looking at sectors, and we've been, for example, very focused on energy systems and looking at that, oh, it's all for the energy systems to change and then we'll be all good. But it's not the case. We'll need to look at energy, we'll need to look at transport, we'll need to look at agriculture, we'll need to look at systems as a whole and make sure that we transform in line with the goals we've set for ourselves. And in this regard, we also need to look at the enablers that can help us to get there. Role for circular economy, role for digitalization, and role for regions, role for people. We really need to engage with everyone and make sure that we take a comprehensive system-wide approach if we are to succeed.
And on that note, thank you so much, particularly to Annika for joining us today. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you to Amanda earlier for her intervention. And that is all we have time for this week. Just a couple of things to mention before we go. Publications to watch out for next week. The first in a series of commentaries on EU-NATO cooperation ahead of the NATO summit in mid-June. And events next week include, on Monday, the latest in the series of EPC Talks Geopolitics with Margaret Macmillan, Emeritus Professor of International History at the University of Oxford. And next Friday, the launch event for a new EPC task force on rethinking EU economic governance. So that's all from us for this week. Thank you very much to you all. Thank you to you for joining us, for your questions and comments. Janis, Fabian and I will be back in a couple of weeks. But in the meantime, I wish you a very pleasant weekend and stay safe. Goodbye.